She was somewhere in Atlanta screaming into the phone. I was sitting on a bench in Savannah watching the sun go down over the water, finally breathing like a man who hadn't drowned. That was the moment I knew I had made the right decision. Let me go back to the beginning, because nothing that happened at that reception hall in October made sense unless you understood what the 31 years before it looked like. I married my wife in 1991. I was 28. She was 26. We got married at a small Baptist church in Columbus, Georgia, and my mother cried the whole ceremony. Not because she was happy. My mother had a gift. She saw things other people didn't want to see. But I was young, and I was in love, and I thought love was enough to build a house on. Her name was Vivian, and for the first few years it was good. Genuinely good. We had our daughter, Nadia, in 1994, then our son, Marcus, and before any of you say anything, I know there's a Marcus in a lot of these stories. This is my real life. That is my son's real name. He was born in 1997, and he came out looking exactly like my father, and I cried in the delivery room in a way I am not ashamed of. I worked in logistics, spent 22 years managing distribution for a regional trucking company out of Macon. Not glamorous. Not the kind of job that gets you invited to speak anywhere. But it was steady and it was honest, and I was good at it. I made a decent living. Not wealthy. Comfortable. We had a 4-bedroom house in a suburb outside Atlanta. 2 cars. The kids went to good schools. Every summer we drove to my wife's parents in Memphis for 2 weeks, and every Christmas her sister flew in from Baltimore. Vivienne worked too. She was a paralegal at a mid-sized firm downtown. Smart woman. Sharp. That was one of the things I loved about her when we met. She knew things, and she wasn't afraid to let you know. She knew them. The trouble with marrying a smart woman who stops respecting you is that she makes sure you feel it. Precisely. Every day, in small ways that are too small to point to but large enough to hollow you out over time. I don't know exactly when it started. Maybe it was always there and I was too invested to see it. But somewhere around year 12 or 13, I started to notice the way she talked to me in front of people. A small correction here. A dismissive laugh there. A bless his heart said with a smile that meant the opposite of what it sounded like. Her friends laughed. I laughed too. Because what else do? You laugh and you go get another drink and you tell yourself it doesn't mean anything. But it meant something. My daughter saw it before I did. Nadia pulled me aside at a birthday party once. She was maybe 19, 20, and she said, "Daddy, why do you let her talk to you like that?" And I told her it was complicated. Adult relationships are complicated. Adult relationships are complicated, which is what you say when you don't have a better answer. The year Nadia graduated from nursing school, I started noticing my wife's phone habits. I am not a suspicious man by nature. I believe people are mostly doing what they say they're doing. But there is a specific way a person holds a phone when they are hiding something, a specific angle of the body, a specific speed with which the screen goes dark when you walk into the room. I noticed. I didn't say anything for a while. I watched. And what I observed over about 4 months was this. My wife had a friend, a man she described as a colleague of a colleague, someone she had met at a professional development conference in Buckhead. His name came up in conversation twice, both times casually, both times unprompted. When people mention someone unprompted twice in a casual way, they are usually thinking about that person a great deal more than casually. I'm going to skip the part where I describe the confirmation of what I already knew. Not because it wasn't painful, it was, but because I've lived with it long enough now that the details don't serve anyone. What I will say is this. By the time I had the conversation with my wife, I already knew everything I needed to know. I didn't shout. I didn't break anything. I sat across from her at our kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in March, and I said, very quietly, "I think we both know this is over." She cried. She apologized, she said it didn't mean anything. And then, in the same breath, she said I had never really been present, that I had never made her feel like a priority, that she had been lonely inside our marriage for years. Maybe some of that was true. I have thought about it many times since. A man has to be honest with himself. But I also know the loneliness inside a marriage is something two people carry together, and she had never once said those words to me while we were in it. She saved them for the exit. We separated in April. The divorce was finalized that November. We had been married 31 years. The house sold in February. After everything was divided, the retirement accounts, the savings, the equity from the house, I walked away with less than I had expected, significantly less. My attorney later pointed out some decisions my wife had made in the 2 years prior to our separation that had reduced certain shared assets, money that had moved in ways I hadn't tracked, because I had trusted her to handle the finances the way she had always handled them. Trust is a wonderful thing. It is also the most expensive thing you can give another person, because when they spend it recklessly, the bill comes to you. I don't want to dwell on the financial details too long. What I will say is that I left that marriage at 60 years old with enough to start over. Not enough to be careless, but enough to make a choice. And I made one. My daughter's college roommate had done a travel nursing assignment in Savannah 2 years prior and talked about it the way people talk about places that changed them. I had driven through Savannah once in my 20s on my way to somewhere else. I remembered the squares. I remembered the Spanish moss. I remembered thinking someday. Someday came in March, 6 months after the divorce was final. I rented a one-bedroom apartment on the east side, near a neighborhood that still had some of the old bones of the city in it. High ceilings, hardwood floors, a small balcony where I could sit in the morning with coffee and watch the street come alive. My monthly expenses, including rent, utilities, groceries, and the occasional dinner out, ran about $2,200. After 31 years of a 4-bedroom house and 2 car payments and someone else's credit card bill, $2,200 a month felt like exhaling. I got a part-time consulting gig through my old logistics network, enough to keep me engaged without consuming me. I started walking every morning, 5 miles through the historic district, through the squares, past the old churches and the oak trees that looked like they'd been standing there since before the country had a name. I lost 14 pounds in 4 months without trying. I started learning things. I took a woodworking class at a community center on Abercorn. I was the oldest person in the room by 15 years, and I was also the worst, and I did not care even slightly. I joined a men's group at a church on the south side, not for religious reasons exactly, but because I had learned that a man alone in a new city needs some kind of anchor. Those men kept me honest. They asked hard questions and didn't accept soft answers. My son didn't call much in those first months. Marcus had taken the divorce hard, or at least he had taken it in a direction I hadn't expected. He had always been close to his mother. That was fine. I had always understood that. But after the separation, something shifted in how he spoke to me. There was a comparison in his voice that hadn't been there before, a measuring, like he was holding me up against something and finding me shorter than he used to think. We had a conversation that fall that I have returned to many times since. He called me on a Sunday afternoon, and we talked about the divorce. And at some point he mentioned that his mother had been seeing someone. I said I knew. He said this person had done well for himself, had a financial advisory firm in Buckhead, nice house in Sandy Springs. He's the kind of man who knows how to take care of things, Dad, my son said. And then, after a pause that felt longer than it probably was, he's got his life together in ways I wish you had. I was quiet for a moment, not because the words hurt, though they did, but because I was deciding what kind of father I wanted to be in that moment. The kind who defends himself, or the kind who lets the record speak, eventually. I told my son I loved him. I told him I hoped he was well, and I ended the call. I sat on my balcony for a long time after that. The sun was going down. A couple was walking a dog in the street below. I thought about the 31 years. I thought about the mornings I had gotten up before 5 to drive to work, so my son could go to a school in a district that cost more than I planned for. I thought about the knee surgery he had sophomore year of high school, and how I had slept in the hospital waiting room because I couldn't make myself go home. I thought about a lot of things that no one was keeping a ledger of. Then I went inside, and I made dinner, and I went to bed. My daughter called me the next morning. She had heard about the conversation. She was not pleased with her brother. I told her to leave it alone. "He's angry, Nadia," I said. "Let him be angry. He'll get there." She didn't sound convinced, but she knew when to stop pushing. About 8 months after I moved to Savannah, my ex-wife, called to tell me she was getting married. I did not learn this from my son. I did not learn it from a mutual friend. She called me herself, which I will give her credit for. She said she wanted me to hear it from her directly. She said she hoped I would be civil about it. I told her I had no reason not to be. I congratulated her. I meant it in the particular way you mean things that don't involve you anymore. My son was asked to be in the wedding. He said yes. He called me afterward to tell me, somewhat guardedly, like he expected an argument. I told him she was his mother, and he should be there. I meant that too. The wedding was in October, an event venue outside Atlanta, something I gathered was fairly upscale. My daughter did not attend. She told her mother she had a shift she couldn't trade. I don't know if that was entirely true, but it was her choice to make. My son called me the night after the reception. This was not the call I expected. He called after midnight, and his voice was different from any version of his voice I had heard in years. Not the careful, measured version he had been using with me since the separation. This was something older, something younger, something that sounded like the boy who used to fall asleep on the couch with his head on my arm. He told me what happened. He had been standing near the head table early in the reception, talking with one of his mother's colleagues from the firm. A woman named Denise, who had known our family for years. Denise didn't know my son was standing within earshot when she leaned over to another guest and said, in a low voice that wasn't quite low enough, "I just hope this one knows what he's getting into." Her first husband worked himself half to death keeping that family afloat, and she spent the last 2 years moving money around before she pulled the trigger. My son said the room felt like it tilted. He didn't say anything to Denise. He walked to the bar. He stood there for a long time. He thought about the Sunday call, about he's got his life together in ways I wish you had. He thought about the knee surgery. He thought about the school district. He called me at 12:43 in the morning from the parking lot of the venue. He said, "Dad, I owe you an apology." I didn't tell him he didn't need to apologize. Some people do that. They wave off the apology before it's even finished, to seem gracious. I didn't do that. I let him say it. I let him say all of it, because he needed to give it, and I had been waiting a long time to receive it, and there is nothing wrong with letting a moment be what it is. We talked for almost 2 hours, standing in that parking lot, him in a rented tuxedo, me on my balcony in Savannah in an old sweatshirt, looking at the same sky from different cities. He asked me what the money situation actually looked like. I told him plainly, without embellishment and without performance. I told him about the retirement account discrepancies my attorney had flagged. I told him about the timing of certain transactions. I told him I hadn't said anything to him or his sister because they were her children too, and it was not my place to weaponize their mother to them. He was quiet for a long time. "Why didn't you fight harder for it?" he asked. I thought about that. "Because I had enough to start," I said, "and I decided starting was more important than winning." He came to Savannah in January, drove down on a Friday after work. I picked him up at a parking garage off Bay Street, and we walked for about an hour before dinner. He looked tired in a way that wasn't about sleep. He kept looking at things. The squares, the old buildings, the way the light came through the trees. like he was trying to understand something he couldn't name. At dinner, I asked him how he was really doing, not how he was doing the way people ask, but how he was doing. He took a long time to answer. He said he'd been thinking a lot about what he wanted his life to look like, that he'd been measuring himself against a version of success that he wasn't sure was actually his. We talked about that for a long time. Before he left on Sunday, he stood in my apartment for a minute, looking around. The woodworking project on the workbench, the books stacked on the side table, the coffee maker that I actually use every morning. He said, "You seem happy, Dad." Like, actually. I told him I was. He hugged me at the door in a way he hadn't since he was about 12 years old, long and without self-consciousness. And then he got in his car and drove back to Atlanta. I stood in the doorway for a minute after he left. The street was quiet. Somewhere down the block, someone was playing music, something slow and low. The oak trees moved a little in the wind. I thought about Denise and her low voice that wasn't quite low enough. I thought about the ledger that nobody keeps but everybody carries. I thought about my mother, who cried at my wedding in 1991, not because she was happy, but because she could see something the rest of us couldn't. I thought justice is not always loud. Sometimes it's a parking lot at midnight. Sometimes it's a phone call from your son with a voice that sounds like the boy he used to be. Sometimes it's sitting on a balcony in Savannah at 62 years old, watching the sun come up, knowing you made it through and knowing, without anyone having to confirm it, that you did not lose. I have learned some things in the last few years that I want to pass along, not as advice because nobody asked me, but as observations from a man who's been where some of you might be standing right now. The first thing is this: a person can be smart and still be wrong about you. Intelligence is not the same as fairness. Don't confuse them. The second thing is, trust is not naivete. I trusted my wife with our finances because trust is a reasonable thing to extend inside a marriage. That she misused, that trust is on her. I refuse to become a suspicious, closed-off man because of one person's choices. That would be giving her more than she already took. The third thing is, your children will get there. If you've been a real father, present, not perfect, but present, they will eventually see it. It may take a parking lot at midnight. It may take longer. But they will get there. Don't poison them against the other parent to speed the process. It is not worth it. And the last thing is this: there is something extraordinary about starting over when you are old enough to know who you actually are. I am not the same man who drove to work before 5 in the morning trying to keep a life together that was leaking from underneath. I am a man who walks 5 miles in the morning, who makes things with his hands, who sits on a balcony and watches the street and feels genuinely, quietly, like he got somewhere. Somewhere Vivienne is living whatever life she is living. I hope she finds what she was looking for. I mean that plainly, without irony. I am done carrying what belongs to someone else. My nephew in my living room and holding room and told Godare, and the rent is mine, the quiet is mine, the morning is mine. And for the first time in a very long time, so am I. I have thought a lot about what made Denise's words land the way they did. Not that she said something extraordinary. She didn't. What she said was plain and factual and spoken in a low voice at a reception hall in October. But plain and factual, said at the right moment to the right person, can do what 30 conversations couldn't. Marcus didn't change because I convinced him. He changed because the truth showed up somewhere he wasn't expecting it, in a voice that had no reason to lie. That's how it usually works in my experience. You can't force the reckoning. You can only live in a way that makes the reckoning possible when it finally comes. I've been thinking about what I would tell a younger version of myself, or what I would tell any man sitting where I was sitting in March of that year, with a divorce behind him and not much certainty ahead. And I keep coming back to 3 things that don't have easy names, but that I felt the weight of. The first is character. Not reputation, character. Reputation is what people say about you when you're not in the room. Character is what actually happened in that hospital waiting room at 2 in the morning when Marcus had his surgery. It's what happened every morning I drove to work before dawn. Nobody was recording it. Nobody was giving out awards for it. But it was real and it accumulated. And when Denise said what she said in that reception hall, my son had 30 years of accumulated reality to measure it against. Character is slow. It doesn't announce itself, but it doesn't disappear either. The second is judgment, the kind that comes from paying attention even when you'd rather look away. I ignored some things in my marriage for too long. I knew what I knew and I set it aside because confronting it was going to cost me something. That cost came anyway, later, with interest. I've learned since then to look at what is actually in front of me, not what I wish were there. When I walked away from the divorce with less than I should have, I could have spent years in bitterness about what I missed. Instead, I studied it. I understood what happened and why, and I made decisions going forward with cleaner eyes. Clarity is hard to come by. You have to be willing to see things you'd rather not see. The third is endurance. And I don't mean the dramatic kind, the gritting your teeth kind. I mean the quiet, daily kind. The kind that looks like walking 5 miles in the morning when you don't feel like it. The kind that looks like joining a woodworking class and being the worst person in the room and going back the next week anyway. The kind that looks like letting your son say what he needs to say at midnight in a parking lot without interrupting him to defend yourself. That kind of endurance doesn't look like strength from the outside. It looks ordinary. But it is what kept me standing long enough for things to come back around. Vivienne made her choices. Marcus made his. I made mine. What I know now is that those choices compound, the same way money compounds. Slowly, then suddenly. You don't always see the interest accumulating. And then one day someone says something at a reception that wasn't meant for anyone to hear. And 30 years of compounding arrives all at once. I don't think life is fair in any automatic way, but I do think it is honest eventually. What you actually did, not what you said you did, not what you intended, tends to find its way to the surface. The only question is whether you've been living something worth surfacing. I have a small apartment in Savannah. I have a son who drove 4 hours on a Friday to sit with me. I have mornings that are entirely my own. That is what 31 years of showing up without recognition and sometimes without appreciation eventually looks like. It looked like enough, more than enough.